Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look at ways that we can work together to help each other in ministry. And today I have Dr. Robert Picirilli with us. He's going to talk to us about history. He has two books I think would be of great interest to you. One is Little Known Chapters in Free Will Baptist History, where he talks about interesting stories from Free Will Baptist history. A second book, which has recently come out, is a little bit like a second volume, and it's Free Will Baptist History, Exploring Our Origins and Identity. And so I encourage you to take a look at those books, have those for your church library, and they would be good books for everyone to read themselves. So Dr. Picirilli, welcome back to the Better Together podcast.
Well, thank you, Brother Eddie. I appreciate the opportunity of being here.
It's good to have you here. So this is probably a bad question to ask a historian, but why is history, and especially Free Will Baptist history, so important?
Well, you can look at that in more than one way. For one thing, it's just plain interesting. But I think it's really important because it helps give us a sense of who we are.
Yes.
One of the problems we Free Will Baptists have is we neglect those things that create a sense of identity, a sense of having pride. I hope that's used in a good way and not a bad way, but of having pride in our denomination. Denominations, in many respects, are becoming old-fashioned, out of date. There isn't very much loyalty to denominations anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is because people don't cultivate a real appreciation for their history and for who they are and for the things that have shaped them and made them what they are. And I think that's the reason that studying Free Will Baptist history is really important, because it helps give us that sense of identity and appreciation for who we are.
And so the young people today would probably say branding. It's what makes us unique. It's what is distinctive about us. And looking at your two books, we have quite a rich Free Will Baptist history.
We do have a rich Free Will Baptist history. There's more than one view or approach or theory about Free Will Baptist history. Some people seem to think that the main aspect of our history is the Randall movement in the North. Other people seem to think that the only history that matters is the movement that came from the English General Baptists in North Carolina through Paul Palmer in 1727. My view of Free Will Baptist history is that there is a mainstream, and that mainstream is the movement that came out of the General Baptist background in North Carolina through Paul Palmer in 1727. But at the same time, I think it's also important that there are a number of tributaries that have fed that mainstream over the years, different kinds of origins that contribute their own unique flavor, particularly in their own areas, but also have affected the whole denomination. So I think our denomination is the product of many different interesting stories, and that's what I've been trying to do in these two volumes you mentioned to start with, to tell these stories, some of them at any rate. There are many, many more that remain to be uncovered and their stories told, and to see the part they've played in contributing to who we are and what we are.
One of the reasons you've been able to share these stories is because they've been recorded and they've been saved. I know visiting the Welch College campus when it was over on West End, I'd see you in the archives quite a bit. I suspect you're there on the new campus a lot as well. Why is it so important, or I guess we're answering the question, that's why it's so important to record our history, isn't it?
Absolutely. I couldn't have written these books if it were not for the Free Will Baptist Historical Collection. Some years ago, the National Association established a historical commission for this very purpose. And two of the main things we do include, first, providing a Free Will Baptist historical collection, which is maintained on the campus in the library at Welch College. The other thing is to maintain a website in which we make a lot of historical materials available to people through their computers. And that's FWBhistory.com. But the historical collection, I do want to emphasize how important that is. If it weren't for saving historical materials and preserving them and having them organized where they can be retrieved and used in an orderly fashion, if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have been able, as I said, to write those 2 books. And there are many, many more stories yet remaining to be told, as I said. And gathering Free Will Baptist historical materials together and keeping them and organizing them and preserving them is, I think, a very important thing for us to do. There are all sorts of materials out there. We need minutes, for example.
Yes.
We have a lot of minutes, thousands of minutes of different Free Will Baptist associations. But one of our purposes is to gather every single association's minutes for its whole history. Now, that's impossible, ultimately, because many of them have perished. But there are still many of them out there that we don't have. We have many gaps, and we want to fill in those gaps. So we need minutes. There are also publications of Free Will Baptists. Different states, different individuals have published materials over the years, papers, newspapers, periodicals of various kinds. And again, one of our purposes is to collect all of those periodicals and have them bound so that they're kept preserved and are easily accessible and can be studied. And of course, lots of other materials as well. Anything that has anything to do with Free Will Baptist history, we need it, we want it, we're interested in it. We need to keep it and preserve it for the contribution it makes to understanding our story.
So those of you out there that may have minutes, you may have some of these documents, you may have even some of these books Dr. Picirilli is talking about, please contact us and we'll look for ways we can arrange to get those. We're in your states from time to time, and that's important for us for maintaining our identity.
Absolutely.
So we've got people that are in churches, just like with the denomination, not paying attention to our history has probably led to some of the people not considering how important it is to be part of the Free Will Baptist denomination. Similarly, a church history is important to pay attention to, isn't it?
It certainly is. As the years go by, the people in a given church need to appreciate their own history and identity and what makes them who they are, and not let that be lost. So it's important for local churches to preserve their histories, to tell their stories, to gather the information, to keep the records, and make sure that all the succeeding generations can know who they are. Even in the Bible, that principle is established because God commanded the Israelites, for example, to have memorials and to keep the records and to tell it to their children and then their children to their children and keep the story alive. And that's important in a local church as well as in a denomination.
And so you'll even see the genealogies throughout the scriptures, another example of maintaining this history. And that's kind of like a family Bible where people are putting when people were married, or a membership list that you have in a church. And so we encourage folks to think about that, maintaining your own history. And you could put that on your church website. You could have it in a church library. You may think that it's not that important, but it really is. And every church should have a clerk that would kind of be responsible for that, wouldn't they? Absolutely.
A clerk's responsibility is an important responsibility in that regard.
One thing I noticed from the second volume, Free Will Baptist History, Exploring Our Origins and Identity, that you talked about the church, the Free Will Baptist Church covenant. And it's interesting, you're pulling a lot of that information out from church minutes, from association minutes, and I suppose even states as well. And we're able to that's how you were able to weave this story together, wasn't it?
Yes. Again, if it weren't for the preservation of those minutes and materials, we wouldn't be able to do that. But it's interesting to look at the story of our Free Will Baptist Church covenant. When the National Association was formed in 1935, primarily bringing together two broad associations of churches, one called the Cooperative General Association, which was primarily the West, but not entirely West, and then the General Conference of the Southeast, bringing those two organizations together. They adopted a church covenant, and the church covenant they adopted was the one that had been used in the Randall movement for quite a number of years, even before that, going back into the 1800s. Across the South, however, there were a number of different forms of church covenants in use. Almost every association had a church covenant printed in its minutes. And the local churches were more or less expected to use those local church covenants. A covenant, I believe, is an important thing for the life of a church. A church is a covenant relationship. And the people need to understand what the covenant requires of them. The understanding of the covenant ought to be made a part of the procedure in any person joining a church, for example, so that they know what's expected of them by that local church. That's where a sense of identity and loyalty come in as well.
And so you can see that it's in the Free Will Baptist Treaties. It's at NAFWB.org, and it's kind of interesting how that covenant goes all the way back to those covenants that ended up in the North and South, the East and the West. And we know that because you were able to find it in these various minutes and so forth. But you also, at the end there, you were talking about how important it is for every church to have a covenant and to think about that as their role.
I really believe, as I said, that a local church is a covenant relationship. And whether a covenant is written or not, though, of course, I think it ought to be written and made a part of the formalities for joining and maintaining the fellowship of a local church. But whether it's written or not, the people in a local church need to understand what this church stands for, what its covenant relationship is, and how it's expressed, and what's expected of them in that regard.
That's great. That's really good. Well, Dr. Picirilli, we so appreciate your work as a historian, your work as a writer, how you've recorded this information for us and those who follow us to have and be able to see our roots. And we just wish you the best. But thank you so much for stopping by to be with us today.
Thank you, Brother Eddie.